Hi there. Today, my guest is Dr. Adam Lowther, who's the Vice President for Research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. He's also the founder and director of the Air Force School for Advanced Nuclear Deterrence Studies and a former Navy petty officer and Air Force civilian leader who shaped this nation's top deterrence programs. Honored to have you on the show today. Thank you for joining, Adam.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, before we dive into your background, I see that you're a baseball fan. Are you a Royals fan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm originally from Houston, so I will always love the Astros, but I do live in Kansas City. I've grown to love the Royals as well. So, especially now with Bobby Witt. I mean, he's a future Hall of Famer. How can you not love him?
Got it. Well, I am a big Rangers fan, so since you're still an Astros fan, we have a little bit of a brawl, but let's put that aside for a minute. Well, back to your background. Could you give me and the listeners an introduction on who you are and how you get here to this point of your life professionally?
Well, so I right now I serve as the Vice President of Research at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, which is the think tank that is. It's a practitioner think tank. So all of us have spent much of our adult lives in the military working for for one of the weapons labs, or, we've been civil servants. We've done all sorts of things that are related to the nuclear enterprise. And so we're the think tank for the nuclear enterprise. We advocate for nuclear modernization and try to educate the public and others about the importance of nuclear deterrence and nuclear enterprise. And so I started my career as a young sailor right out of high school. And, one of the things that the Navy's really good at is encouraging young sailors to get out and go to school. And so that's what I did is I got out and I went to school and I liked school. So I decided to get a PhD. And then I taught at a university for a couple of years, and I thought, man, I really miss the military. And I got a phone call from some guys who I went to school with, and the Air Force Chief of Staff was creating his own think tank. And they said, "Hey, we're going to stand up this new think tank for the Air Force Chief of Staff. We want you to come stand it up with us." It was called the Air Force Research Institute, and it was at Maxwell Air Force Base. And I said, "Sure, that sounds great." And then I got there and I had written a couple of books on terrorism and asymmetric warfare. This is, during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I had gotten a PhD writing about asymmetric warfare. And then the Air Force had a incident in which we flew weapons from Minot to Barksdale, and nuclear weapons. Everybody had said after the Cold War, we did, these are Cold War relics. We don't need them anymore. And we kind of forgot about them. And then they flew them inadvertently from one Air Force base to another Air Force base, and then we cared about them again. And so I they said, "Hey, we need somebody who's going to look at nuclear weapons, and is how do we the Air Force, because the Air Force had we had shut down Strategic Air Command, and we had taken our eye off the prize. We had divided the nuclear enterprise." And they said, "Hey, you're going to be the nuke guy." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about nuclear weapons." And they said, "Well, it's we're giving you the ball." So I started looking into it and learning about it, and then I thought, man, this is actually really cool. So I got to be a part of the Air Force's much larger effort to sort of rejuvenate the nuclear enterprise. And ultimately, in 2015, I spent 6 or 7 years working on that and trying to help the Air Force, make good decisions and educate its airmen, because I taught at the War College and did some other teaching for the service, and helped with some the stand up of Global Strike Command, and did a bunch of other things. And then ultimately, the Global Strike Commander, General Sevy Wilson, said, "Hey, I want to build a schoolhouse that is going to focus on developing, nuclear expertise." And so I was working with Global Strike Command at the time, and I got tasked to be the guy to go stand that school up. And so I got to stand up what is affectionately known as SANS, which was a fitting name because we were at Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is a desert. So Sands in the desert was a great name for the School of Advanced Nuclear Deterrence Studies, and then spent a few years there, and then ultimately left, and I ended up going back to Global Strike Command for about a year, and then ultimately came up to Kansas City to teach at the Army's. They have a great school. It's called SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies, where they build the world's best operational planners. And then spent some time at Stratcom because I missed the nuclear world working for the Army, but I learned a lot there. And then a few years ago, myself and a guy named Curtis McGiffin and Jim Petrosky and a friend of ours, a retired General Krusty Goodfellow, they said, "Hey, we need a think tank to advocate for the nuclear enterprise because most think tanks are support nuclear disarmament." So we said, "Well, hey, we want to advocate for it because we believe in this mission and we think that it's something important, and we all had a background in it." And so we stood up NIDS, the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, and that's kind of a snapshot of about a 30-year career.
So, why do you believe that having more nuclear weapons is better for deterrence and for preventing the conflict rather than, from what I understand, more mainstream idea to not use them as much?
Well, so we use nuclear weapons every day. Right? They're used every single day, and they're used to deter the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans, not only from using nuclear weapons, but they also deter great power wars. Because we've lived in a world where there were no nuclear weapons. That was the world prior to 1945. And between 1914 and 1945, we lost 100 million people in two great power wars. But not only that, if you look at the end of World War One, there was a travesty that we don't generally attribute to World War One, but was a direct result of that. And that was the rise of the Soviet Union. And, 50 million, at least 50 million Russians were murdered by the communists in Russia. And, so if you tack on another 50 million to the 30 million who died in war, and then if you go to 1945, what was a direct result of World War Two? Well, that was the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the defeat of the nationalists. And there you had at least another 50 million people who perished in China because of the rise of communism. So, the United States is two great foes, both during the Cold War and then now after the Cold War, came about because of great power wars. And so when people say that they want to move to a world without nuclear weapons, I say absolutely not. I know what that world looks like. And it looks like a world where about every 2 to 3 decades, the great powers will go to war and fight each other. And they'll kill tens of millions of people because we have the data. We can look back hundreds of years and we know that every 20 to 40 years, great powers are going to go to war and they're going to kill millions. And so I don't want to live in that world. And I've had the pleasure of living in a world, I'm 50 years old, and my entire life I've lived in a world where great powers didn't fight each other. And the only reason that happens is because of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, because of the potential destruction that they can wreak, have kept the great powers from saying yes, today is the day that we fight. They've always said, not today, my friend, not today. And I want to keep a world where great powers don't fight each other. A war, could you have imagined if sometime soon after 1945, the United States and its European allies fought the Russians? That would have been a devastating war. And if the US and China were to potentially fight, that would be a devastating war. I want a world in which there is no war. And the best way that I know to make that happen is for the great powers to have nuclear weapons because it promotes peace. And if you look at conflict related casualties in the 400 years prior to 1945, about 2% of the world's population died every single year to conflict. Every single year, 2%. So we live in a world of what, 7 billion people? So what would 2% of 7 billion be? I think that's what, about 140 million people? So could you imagine 140 million people a year dying because of conflict. That would be tragic. Well, what is it now? We lose 0.1% to conflict every year, from 2% to 0.1%. I would say that is a win for the world. And if you look at population, the world's population, this is why we have, people say, climate change is a terrible thing. Well, why is it such a problem? Because the world's population has tripled since 1945. It's tripled. Well, why is it tripled? Because there's a whole lot more people that have not died in conflict. And so therefore population growth has increased. And that is because of nuclear weapons, and the reduction in the number of people who died in conflict has allowed a peaceful world to prosper, and for the population of the world to grow.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. Well, my question to your argument is, what about the war in Ukraine? Since Russia does have a lot of nuclear weapons, a lot of the countries that back Ukraine also have them. You can look at it as a proxy war, kinda, because it's like one side, like the arms go to one side, but then you have a major power on the other side. So it's kind of weird. But it didn't stop the war, and the casualties are quite high there. So what's your perspective there? Should Ukraine have not given up its nuclear weapons back in the 90s, and that would prevented the war, or what is your perspective on that?
Also, Ukraine is of course, a tragedy, and the rationale for the Russians to invade Ukraine is, it's quite a long one. But the simple fact is that deterrence has worked in Ukraine, and it's worked for the Russians, because the U.S. and the Europeans have specifically limited what and how they support Ukraine, because they didn't want to cross a Russian red line. So I would say that Ukraine is an example of deterrence working. It's just an example of deterrence working for the Russians, not for the Americans. And so, we've been very specific in what we give the Ukrainians, how we let them use it. And those kinds of things are examples of deterrence working, but for the Russians. Now, your question about should the Ukrainians have kept their nuclear weapons. Well, they never really had nuclear weapons. The Russians had nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil. The Ukrainians didn't have, release authority. They didn't have the codes. There was, they could have they had ICBMs on their soil, but they didn't have the capability to use them. So they would have had to have, had very good engineers to disassemble them, ensure that the pits and the, were still good, and that the weapons actually worked. And then they would have had to have reassemble them into a new weapon. And so it wouldn't have been just to keep them and then use them, because they didn't have the capability to use them as they existed. And so when the Ukrainians gave them up, in essence, they used them as a bargaining chip. And, for those weapons, the Russians gave them lower priced oil. And there were some tangible goods that the Russians gave the Ukrainians for giving those weapons back to the Russians. Now, the bigger question of Ukraine, it's a question of history, it's a question of strategy, it's a question of geography. And I think Vladimir Putin has been fairly clear in what he thinks and why he did what he did. Right or wrong, of course, it's going to be from a Russian perspective. And the Ukrainians are very clearly an independent nation who, if we uphold international rules and norms, the Russians did absolutely violate the rules of international law. But, there's all this history behind it that sometimes I think people overlook and have dismissed away in trying to understand, that terrible, tragic war.
Yeah, but how can we use nukes to prevent wars like that? Even if, let's say, nuclear deterrence prevents direct war with between the U.S. and Russia, or U.S. and China, or U.S. and Iran, or other quite major players, it seems to not be very good at stopping wars like a war in Ukraine, or a war in Vietnam or Afghanistan, where it's happening on the soil of the nation that doesn't have the nukes. So is that the downside of the strategy, that you still have, countries that will be susceptible to these kinds of conflicts, or is there a solution to that as well?
Nuclear weapons are never going to stop all violence or all war. They're not designed to do that, and they're never going to do that. But what they do is they tamp down the type and severity of violence. And so if you think about violence as a pyramid, and the capstone of that pyramid at the very top is nuclear war. And so nuclear war would be the most dangerous but the least likely. And then below that there's, let's pick a layer below that, and you've got great power war. World War 1, World War 2. And then, you can call it, major combat operations, below a level below that. So you could maybe something to the effect of like a Vietnam or a Korean War. And then below that, you've got lesser included conflicts. So that might be something like Afghanistan or, Bosnia Herzegovina. And then you've got insurgencies and a layer below that, and then terrorism at the very bottom. And as you go down the pyramid, they become more likely but less dangerous. And so if you're the United States and you're most countries, you want to force conflict down to the bottom. And so in the end, while we of course don't want to be the victims of terrorism, if you can force your adversary to the point where their only outlet is terrorism, you've essentially won, because terrorism is not an existential threat to the United States for sure, and to most other countries as well. Now, you'll never stop all outlets of violence. That would be like saying, we're going to stop every crime. There will never be a burglary, a car theft, purse snatching, and everybody recognizes that that's never going to happen. But they want to try to reduce it as much as they can. So, war is similar in that you'll never stop all war, but you can reduce the frequency and severity. And that's what nuclear weapons are actually really good at. Because not only do great powers not fight each other, but most great powers, like the United States, have allies. We've got over 30 allies in NATO, and they're covered by the nuclear umbrella of the United States. And then we've got the Japanese and the South Koreans, who are also covered by the nuclear umbrella. And so countries, now remember, most wars are fought between neighbors. The United States is alone in the world in being a nation that never fights its neighbors and only fights thousands and thousands of miles away. Well, that's a good thing for us and for the American people, but we're alone in the world. Most countries fight their neighbors. But if you're an ally of the United States, you're not going to fight your neighbor, because your neighbor knows that the United States is there to back you up and to defend you. And so not only do you tamp down great power wars, but you tamp down war between your allies and their adversaries. And that's why you get this multiplying effect of a reduction in conflict related casualties. So Ukraine is one of those examples where, Ukraine is not a treaty ally of the United States. So it did not have the protection of the United States nuclear umbrella. And that's the tragedy for Ukraine. And that was, of course, what Vladimir Putin wanted to ensure never happened, right? That's sort of why he attacked when he did, was because when Ukraine is saying, hey, we want to be a part of the European Union, and hey, we want to be a part of NATO, Vladimir Putin knew, I've got to attack them and invade them before that umbrella covers them. And so that was in part of the explanation of his timing. And so being under that umbrella is, sort of the great thing. But if you're not under that umbrella, the world is, a little more dangerous for you.
And do you think it's a good idea to expand that umbrella to protect more nations? Or, like in case of Ukraine, it might cause even more problems because other powers don't want that, don't want the US to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine is sort of a case of being in the worst possible place that you can be, right? The geography, the positioning of Ukraine, and the history of Ukraine with Russia, you just couldn't be in a worse situation than Ukraine. Whereas, let's say you're Chile or Argentina, you don't have some of those historical and geographic challenges that Ukraine has. or the Baltic states, for example. The Baltic states were kind of lucky that they were able to get into NATO when they got into NATO. Ukraine just wasn't quite that lucky. And so spreading the umbrella, it would depend on each individual country and the circumstances and the relationship with the United States and the potential threats, because most countries generally don't have the kinds of existential threats that were present during the Cold War. I mean, Europe was worried that the Red Army was going to roll all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. That was a legitimate fear. So therefore, the nuclear umbrella had a real relevance. In South Korea, for example, the North Korean, they don't have a they don't have a peace treaty. That war is, it's still a war. It's a war that is paused, but if you listen to Kim Jong Un, he wants to finish that war. And so the nuclear umbrella has real tangible benefits for the Republic of Korea. And so, it just depends on the country and it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, yeah, this explains a lot, and I think your perspective gives a new way to look at the war in Ukraine as well as a consequence of this idea of a nuclear umbrella and being protected and not protected by it. As a person who has expertise knowledge on the matter, how close were we to the top of the pyramid during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And could something like that happen again in the future?
Yeah, so this is one of the for advocates of nuclear disarmament. They often bring the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then 1983 there was an exercise called Able Archer, in which advocates of nuclear disarmament say that the Russians all thought we were going to launch a nuclear weapon. I can tell you that that's abjectly false. That's a misreading of Russian behavior in 1983. Able Archer was a headquarters exercise. No troops moved, no nuclear weapons were involved, and the Russians didn't even know what was going on. We know that, now after the fact, that the Russians had no idea Able Archer was actually happening because it was a communications exercise. Uh, so the real possible use of nuclear weapons could have been in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there was at one point where a Soviet submarine was trying to run the blockade, and of course the the message was, if you're attacked, respond with nuclear weapons. And as the story goes, we're depth charging that Soviet submarine to force it to surface, and by virtue of depth charging it, that was essentially the provided the authorization needed for that submarine to use nuclear weapons. But the political commissar, if I remember the story correctly, the political commissar on the boat told the boat's captain, the sub's captain, no, we're not going to use nuclear weapons. And then the submarine, turned around and did not try to run the blockade. And so that probably would have been the closest time, but we've really never had any sort of we've never had an accidental detonation. So I don't really worry about accidental detonations. I don't worry about miscalculations. And, if you look at the safety mechanisms, we've actually, in the United States, we've had nuclear accidents with nuclear weapons. We've blown them up. We had an ICBM that blew up and it flung the warhead a mile, and the warhead didn't go off. Why? Because we've built in redundant safety systems. We've accidentally dropped nuclear weapons. They fell out of an aircraft, and because they were not armed, they didn't go off. An airplane's burned up on a tarmac and had nuclear weapons and it didn't go off. And it's because we build in redundant safety systems. And these accidents have all happened at least from 40 to 60 years ago. And the technology we have today is not the same. We've been improving safety systems, since the 1960s, and the what happened in Damascus, Arkansas in the early 1980s. That was with technology from the 60s. So I don't really worry about accidental detonations. I don't worry about miscalculations. I don't worry about those kinds of things because we're better than we were 40 to 60 years ago. The Russians are better than they were 40 to 60 years ago. And the Chinese are getting better. They're better than they were. And so we've learned a lot. And therefore, things like accidental detonations, miscalculations, those have increasingly gone down as a probability over time.
Got it. Got it. Appreciate you sharing that. And before we end the episode, I'll let you give the final message to the listeners, whatever you want to share, maybe something around this topic or anything else.
Well, I guess I would just say that nuclear weapons are as relevant today as they've ever been. They're probably more because our strategic environment is more complex than it's ever been. Whereas during the Cold War, we worried about the Soviet Union. Now we worry about the Soviet Union. We worry about the People's Republic of China, who is going to build is in the process of building a nuclear arsenal as good as and as large as ours, if not better and larger. And then we have the North Koreans who are building what they say is going to be an arsenal of 500 nuclear weapons, which will be, not as large as ours, but still big enough to, cause devastation to the United States. And so it's an interesting time to live. It's a great topic to be smart on. And if you're interested in it, I would encourage you go to Global Security Review. It's my organization, the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. We have an online journal called Global Security Review. Go read our articles. We have a podcast called The NIDS View. Go listen to that podcast. And we have regular live events that you can watch online. But go to our website, thinkdeterrence.com, and engage with us. And we're always available. And nuclear deterrence, it's a great topic to be thinking about these days.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your perspective today, Adam. My pleasure to host you and to learn from you.
All right. Thanks. It's great to be with you.